Futures trading involves risk and is not suitable for all investors. Content provided in this segment is meant for educational purposes and is not a solicitation to buy or sell commodities.
It's Steve and Joe from Fresh Agenda, Everag's Global Insights team. And Steve, we're here with a bit of an update on markets, of course. A big update on GDT 383, which was a very interesting one this week. Some highlights of our latest global dairy directions outlook, and of course, Chow of the Week.
Okay, we've made it to July 2025. So kick us off, Joe, with some of the market highlights.
Yeah, look, just looking at Europe at the moment where it's steaming hot. EU spot milk prices and cream did firm last week, and it's probably a lot to do with some of the weather and also some of the competition for milk in key regions over there. The rain that we saw over the last couple of weeks hasn't really altered this dynamic, at least in the short term, has it, Steve?
No, that's for sure. It's probably a distant memory now, that rain, because the focus is all on just how hot it is this early in summer.
Yeah, it hasn't really translated to spot and futures markets, though, Steve. Butter futures, you're just seeing them weakening a little bit. EU butter continues to differ between spot and the futures market.
Bit of a pushback on demand, maybe. It's still being felt there.
And skim milk powder is also dropping across the curve. The weaker US dollar is going to have an impact on EU exporters' competitiveness, obviously. And of course, we've got this ongoing issue with demand, ingredient demand. So just drifting lower there, Steve.
Staying with skim milk powder or non-fat milk powder, it's also weakened in the US. Not by as much, it would seem from that, but a little forward concern perhaps about the size of the growth in milk that might be expected is a theory. When we look at cheese, that is a weird-looking curve going from, and really that front month is probably academic right now, spot prices are well below where that is. But after that short-term dip, we have a bit of carry, and so there's some fairly obvious money to be made there in the short term, you would think. Look, retail sales data has been a little weaker in recent times, but we have seen a little bit of a recovery in food service in some indicators. You have to dig deep to get some positivity out there. We'll talk more about that later. This time, GDT, we're at that difficult event at the start of the month of July when we see a ramp up in offer volumes. We'll have a bit of a look at that. But look, there are a few positive results in this summary. Yes, there's a forward contract, the first contract in AMF, the C2 skim milk powder price stabilised, and some of the EU contracts. Again, I have to dig pretty deep to find anything green, in the way we set out our summary sheets. But, heavy falls in whole milk powder and butter. When we look at what occurred, whole milk powder losses were worse later. And a bit of a theme, Joe, that when you can see it in butterfat, you can see it in skim milk powder, the price falls at the peak of availability were certainly heavier. EU's whole milk powder was a little weaker this time after a few rises. Skim milk powder was flat in the second contract, but, fell by up to 5% when you go out to C4. Quite a different result. Cheddar also had worse losses later, but averaging, sub 4,900. So it's quite we've come back quite a bit in that market.
Yeah, those New Zealand prices really getting hammered, Steve. Just to focus in on fats and cheese, there was a fairly significant increase in New Zealand butterfat offerings above the forecast last week. So that will have had an impact on those very large falls in butterfat prices at this week's event. Smaller changes in EU product in US dollars, but worse in euros. EU butter was down 3% and EU mozzarella fell 2% at this event. Butter was the only product with higher demand, but obviously that didn't mean that much given the results that we've got. Weakest butter demand for 14 events. There was actually 400 tonnes of butter added, not to C1 and C2, Steve, added to those later periods, but we really saw it crush those prices, didn't we?
Yeah, 400 tonnes may not seem much, but when you put it on top of what 1,800 was offered before, that is, as you said, it's a meaningful increase.
22%.
Yes. Forward prices for whole milk powder, as we said, dipping heavier later to do with probably improved expectations about New Zealand milk. If it stops raining on the South Island, that might occur. Look, to give this some context, and this is fairly important, and, why we talk about this, GDT is a critical price discovery event in the world market, and
especially for whole milk powder.
yeah, and skim milk powder as well. It's quite influential. To put some context around there, we're seeing a big seasonal step up in volumes, which is nothing new, but the fact that we've had lower offered volumes in recent months means that as we come back up towards July, and we've got very similar offers in July and August, really from here on through the peak, it's a bigger catch-up than we've seen in the past few years. So I took a bit of a dip into this, Joe, and pulled out my usual nerdy charts. Yep. Here's another way of looking at it. So how the 2025 uplifts compare to previous years, it's quite stark, isn't it? You go from there, we're comparing this event to last event, and then the next uplift, because there's another step up which occurs in the first August event, which is significant, and a bigger increase in prior years. But this year, the event we've just seen has a bigger uplift. But then when you compare event 15 to 12, that's very stark. It's, getting up towards almost tripling the volume available in whole milk powder. This applies to other products as well. Look, to this extent, you can't really do like for like. I'll talk about skim milk powder soon because we have other buyers involved. So it's not a clean comparison really when you look into others.
Just looking at the buying side, Steve, now we've done a good job on the supply side. There was a strong lift in China's involvement. They actually accounted for above 50% of that increased volume, which, is a fairly positive event. We've dug out some more positives, Steve, and that's the best tonnage since December 2024. And just looking at Southeast Asian buying, it has picked up, but still lagging well behind the previous years, as you can see in that chart, Steve. That's not the case in general trade. We've seen whole milk powder trade into the region fairly strong for the first 4 months of the year, Steve.
Certainly, so not much of it on GDT, obviously.
And then, we always see this pattern with Middle Eastern buyers. The price drops and they come back out to stake their claim. So easing prices, more Middle East action for whole milk powder.
This is an important one to watch. As we see more volumes come, will we see more assistance from this region?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So back to this issue of seasonality, and this is where we can do a kind of like for like, comparing this event to the previous one, and then being careful to state what Fonterra is offering between 15 and 14, events 15 and 14 in the calendar. So the uplift is bigger for skim the next time. But the seasonal lifts in skim have been something we've seen in the past. It's not new for this category, but we're getting a bit more this time.
Yeah. Again, something to watch.
Yeah. So, again, losses heavier as you go into peak months for the forward prices, and these prices are converging. And this gets a bit worse, Joe, when you go later than the second contract. This is, as I said, C2 really didn't shift, and in fact, not much movement at all. As you can see, those lines kind of worm towards flat. The New Zealand price for C3 was actually well below the European price. So, interesting trend to keep watching.
Yeah, and just looking at the buy side again, Steve, small improvement from China. You just see that dark line edging up there compared to the previous years. Southeast Asian buyers also trending a bit higher with those added volumes. So again, some positives there in terms of tonnages cleared, I guess.
Yeah. Heavy falls in butterfat prices, comparing the black line to the orange here, which narrowed a bit. So a little bit different to the other commodities. There isn't the big lift in butter as we see in the powders in coming months.
Forward, yeah.
Yeah, so that's a bit of a difference. AMF curve just looks weird, doesn't it? It stepped down around 5 to 6%. If you leave out that first freakish result, someone either had a heavy finger or stick at keyboard caught short. But if you take that out of it, we've stepped down for one event 5 to 6%. It's pretty chunky.
So this discount has narrowed a little bit, Steve, with this latest result, with butter prices going down substantially. And the other favourite I have is this whole milk powder versus synthetic value based on skim milk powder and AMF. And those values are pretty much locked together again, Steve, with this latest result as well.
Come back after the last couple of events, it's fallen sharply, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So where that leaves us against pulse?
Yeah, interesting. Skim milk powder price actually, the C2 price actually lifted above the pulse result from last week. And was slightly higher, at least for that C2, as you said, which didn't move a lot than the previous auction number 382. And for whole milk powder, we've just got this very, very steady decline, haven't we, Steve? And that trend has just continued with this latest result at 383.
Yeah.
Mm.
So we are in a couple of hours about to push out our June outlook. It'll be dated 2nd of July in Australia. Joe, I thought it'd be good if we just showed the burning issues. We have this chart.
There's a lot of burning going on there.
There's a big fire raging, really. We should put little fire symbols against each line. That might be more meaningful. So as we said in Copenhagen, and as we said a month ago, we're not going to talk about all these points. Everyone's relieved because the minutes are ticking past. Just the ones highlighted here in yellow are probably the most important. They're the ones that are burning the strongest.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of them are to do with weather. Forecast conditions in Europe have got a little worse, we think, after this weather burst. Is certainly going to get people very focused on availability and conditions in New Zealand, even though there's quite a mix there. There's a lot of rain right now.
Yeah.
The demand side has got some pretty big issues out there. There's sluggish cheese demand in the US. Whilst there's a lot of demand issues being watched, in particular, the changing marketplace with the impacts of tariffs and retaliation we've called out there. But if we were to look at this, Joe, and you asked me the question, what was the question you asked me?
What was the most compelling, interesting chart from this month's outlook, Steve, was the question.
And I came up with his. So we've probably used this before, certainly nothing that nothing new. But look, this tells the story of the declining per capita cheese demand in the US. This is based on commercial disappearance, it's called, which is a proxy for demand. But if you extend it over time, so we like to use this as a rolling comparison. This shows the official population. It's based on the official population. So, that's been declining since the end of 22. We're well into a few years of this now, where we've seen this static. The difference is the population growth is also going to slow between now and 29 at least, right, with different policies in play. And I'd have to say, Joe, we've looked at stats on this or opinions on this. The undocumented members of the population resident in the US probably grown since 22. Mm-hmm. So this number would look a little worse if you factor that inclusion in, whether it's trending up or not. But it's probably a steeper decline. So that's a big challenge for the US industry, relevant to the global market, because where's that cheese going to go if it's coming out of new plants and looking for a home? So there's a lot of indicators in the domestic market which aren't firing yet. The export markets where it's all got to happen for the US. Okay, comparison of where this leaves us in the market.
Yeah, look, just summing up all the moving parts for this week, Steve. New Zealand forwards for butterfat and GDT prices have weakened. EU's a little softer. And the US is a little firmer. Really interesting spread there at the moment, Steve.
With New Zealand butterfat cheaper than US.
Yeah.
Which we thought would take a fair while this year. That's quickly turned round.
And looking at skim milk powder, New Zealand and EU weaker in skim milk powder. Serious dislocation of GDT and NZX futures, which we would, expect would move a little bit more in alignment, but very different directions there, Steve. Interesting.
Okay, chart of the week, Joe. How would you wrap it up?
Yeah, look, staying in the US actually, Steve, and we got the latest reading on consumer sentiment out of the University of Michigan. Confidence for June was up 16% from May. This reading is a little bit stronger than the preliminary reading, and it's mostly about inflation expectations a year out, moderating a little bit for consumers. So in the early reading for June, it was expected inflation would hit 6.6% in a year, which is very high. And now they're expecting 5%, which is also high, but not as high. We're still 18% below where we were in December 2024, Steve, so just after the presidential election. So still a little way to go in terms of consumer confidence, and that will be playing into cheese demand, the tendency for people to eat out and spend a bit more on going out for meals. So again, one to watch.
Okay. Thank you, Joe. Don't forget, if you want to have a look at our new product range, which is less new than what it was when we first started mentioning this.
It's getting better though, Steve.
It is. It is. We're getting sharper. Just go to that scan code or drop us an email and we'll put you on for a really long trial. Thanks for watching. We'll be back again next week.